Of all the Gospels, only John tells this story about Jesus overturning the tables in the temple at the start of Jesus' ministry. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it happens toward the end of his ministry and is basically the last straw for the people in power who opposed Jesus. Probably it was not something Jesus did twice. And probably this disruption in the temple was not something the temple authorities would have let slide early on. So there's reason to think that Matthew, Mark, and Luke got the timing right. Why would John tell the story differently? We know that each of the Gospels was written down by someone looking back, remembering Christ's ministry as best they could, but also telling his story like a sermon does, wanting to make a point and elicit a response. John alludes to this work of remembering as he tells the story. He mentions how Christ's disciples will look back after his crucifixion and resurrection. They'll remember what Jesus said and understand his words anew. As John looked back and tried to make sense of Jesus' life, he must have seen this story about Jesus flipping tables in the temple as foundational and essential. John decided to tell it up front. I've been reading lately about how events imbued with intense emotion can point to who we are and what we value. The motivational speaker and author Simon Sinek says that if we look back at our lives, particularly our standout memories and defining moments, we can find in those stories clues about what we most deeply value and why we think we're here, our sense of purpose in life. In his book about discovering your purpose, a book Sinek calls Find Your Why, he suggests that people start by identifying experiences they've had that have really shaped who they are today, stories, good and bad, that have helped make you who you are. Think of specific stories, he says. The more specific you are, the more you'll feel an emotional connection to the memory. And it's this emotional connection that will lead to your why. He says, once you've identified the emotion that imbued an important event in your life, you can probe that feeling to see why it mattered. Say you felt disappointed. You've probably felt disappointed before. What was it about that particular feeling of disappointment that was so different that it still comes to mind all these years later? Or say you felt happy. What was it about this particular experience that made you happy? Probing your feelings is a way to clarify what you needed at the time, what you care about now, what motivates you. Today's story from the Gospel according to John tells about a time Jesus was impassioned. The description of his actions in the temple that day is actually one long sentence in the Greek. That makes it come in a rush. How Jesus came into the temple and found the people who were selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifice, and all the people involved in exchanging currency. And Jesus made a whip from the ropes and chased the people and the animals out of the temple. And he scattered the coins and overturned the tables of the money changers and said to the dove sellers, "Get these things out of here. Don't make my Father's house a place of business." Jesus had probably felt frustrated before about the business of the temple. What was it about that particular time that pushed him over the edge? I wonder. When Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the story, they remember him accusing people who were selling and buying things in the temple of having made God's house a den of robbers or a hideout for crooks. Jesus seems to have uncovered some abuses in the system, ways that people were being cheated. But in John's telling of the story, Jesus doesn't speak about robbers or crooks. He's upset that his Father's house has become a place of business. That means he's upset about the system itself, because it was common practice for animals to be sold in the temple, Animal sacrifice was an important part of temple worship. The book of Leviticus provides instructions for such sacrifices. And it was common practice for money to be changed right there, so people from out of town would have the right currency to buy what they needed. It was nearly time for the Passover, so people had come from many places to worship God. It was their custom to meet God in the temple with a sacrifice. Jesus seems upset about their custom. After living with Jesus, watching him die, and encountering him risen again, Christ's disciples looked back at events like this and came to some conclusions about Christ's why. They believed that Jesus had come into the world to make God available to people in a whole new way. Christ's very body had become the new location for God, the new place people could meet God. The new temple was Jesus himself. What was it about the business of the Jerusalem temple that so frustrated Jesus that he went in there and turned everything upside down? Maybe he'd say, the temple is what got in the way of people recognizing him. Everyone was so used to the money, the animals, the rituals of sacrifice, that they couldn't see the new thing God was doing in Jesus. It made Jesus crazy, all that stuff that got in the way. He would spend the rest of his life overturning things like those tables in the temple, things that kept people from encountering God and receiving God's abundant life as Jesus was offering it to the world. People often tell this story about Jesus cleansing the temple to say that Jesus got angry like we do. John doesn't use the word anger, but that does seem to be part of what's filling Jesus here, an anger we recognize as human. But I've come to think that in this story, the anger filling Jesus also points to something divine in him. Jesus was revealing God to us, God's anger about the way things were, and God's determination to change them. Exercising and even recognizing anger can be tricky for anyone, but particularly, I'd say, for women, maybe especially for white and rather privileged women like me. I read an article in the New York Times Magazine recently by a woman, a white woman, named Leslie Jameson, who said that for years she described herself as someone not prone to anger. I don't get angry, she'd say. I get sad. Sadness seemed more refined to her somehow and more selfless. She was holding the pain inside herself, not inflicting it on anyone else. But a few years ago, she began to expect that her refrain, I don't get angry, I get sad, masked something about herself she hadn't yet realized, that she was angrier than she thought. She told one story, clearly one of her defining moments, about a time early in her teaching days. She was in a faculty meeting and distributed statistics about how many female students in her department had reported instances of sexual harassment the year before, more than half of the students. A faculty member grew indignant and insisted that most of those claims probably didn't have any basis at all. Jameson clenched her fists and struggled to speak. It wasn't that she knew what had happened in each of those cases, but their sheer volume seemed horrifying. It demanded attention. She hadn't expected that anyone would resist the numbers or insist she explain why it was important to look at them. What did she feel in that moment? It wasn't sadness. It was rage. But it was years before Jameson could name that. And it was years before she could see how her anger was something more than an emotion to be felt and either hidden inside or vented on someone else. It took some time for her to see how anger is a tool to be used, that it's a catalyst for useful discomfort and clearer dialogue. It's not just a blaze burning structures down. It can also cast a glow, generate heat, and bring bodies into communion. This article was published in January, almost a year after the Women's March in Washington. And that experience in particular had come to mind for Jameson. She said that when she walked in that march, one body among thousands, the act of marching didn't just mean claiming the right to a voice. It meant publicly declaring her resolve to use her voice. She's come to think of anger in similar terms, not as a claiming of victimhood, but as an owning of accountability. She sees anger as more like an itch than a wound. It demands that something happen. It demands that something change. Community organizers frequently ask about anger. They ask about anger when they want to help people identify what in the world they want to see change, what they're willing to declare their resolve to speak about and rally around and work to reform. What keeps you up at night, they ask. What injustice can't you stomach anymore? As I've thought about their questions, I've realized what I've gotten angry about has changed over the years. There are common themes, for sure. Fairness is a big one for me, always has been. When I was a kid, it was like, is someone getting more ice cream than I am? Or is my sister taking up more room in the back seat of the car? Because that's what mattered to me. As I've aged, what's mattered to me has shifted. So different injustices make me angry now. Like when someone can't find good and affordable health care, because insurance has been so important to my family, particularly as my niece has dealt with cancer. I want everyone to have the health care they need. Or I get angry when someone can't choose the restroom they feel comfortable using, because I have transgender friends who want to use a restroom that's different than the one they were told to use as a child. And I think they should have that option. I also get frustrated with the strict rules we have in the United States about who can live in this country and why. Because I've heard so many stories about refugees and other immigrants who, for whatever reason, are here and need to be here and can't secure the right papers to stay. I hurt for them. I also feel angry that not everyone feels safe when a police officer pulls them over. Because I have Black friends who've seen people who look like them beaten and shot by police, and they're scared. Not just scared, they're angry. Even 10 years ago, I didn't get that. What matters to me has changed, as new experiences have impacted me. And that's true for all of us, because of who we are and because of what or whom we encounter. We come to care about new and different things. We have the choice to open ourselves to new people and new concerns as we go through life. I think that part of following Jesus is allowing his commitments to shape our commitments, letting the things he got worked up about shape the things that we get worked up about. If you keep reading through the Gospel according to John, you will see more stories about Christ's defining moments, stories that reveal what Jesus cared about and thought needed to change. Like the time Jesus reached out to heal a man who couldn't walk well. Jesus broke the law to do that. He wasn't supposed to heal on the Sabbath. Healing delayed is healing denied, he might have said. Or like the time Jesus fed thousands of people miraculously with just a little bread and a little fish. He satisfied their hungry bodies, but also offered his body to assuage their deepest hunger. I am the bread of life, Jesus said. His intent to nourish life in hungry people was never clearer. Or the time Jesus approached a Samaritan woman at a well. Men weren't supposed to talk so intimately with women, and Jews categorically mistrusted Samaritans, even despising them. Jesus showed himself determined to cross the boundaries his society erected and to empower outsiders to do his work. Or the time Jesus was asked about a woman caught in adultery. He could have judged her harshly, like the authorities wanted him to, but he didn't. He said whoever had no sin could judge her and punish her, and not a person dared to do it. Jesus gave that woman her life and her dignity back. Time and again, Jesus spoke passionately about the need for his followers to love one another and to show that love in acts of forgiveness and service and sacrifice. In the Gospel according to John, Christ's love for the world is basically what got him killed. That makes me wonder where our passion for Christ's commitments and our resolve to follow him put us at risk, if they do put us at risk. In the same chapter as today's story about Jesus in the temple is the story of the wedding at Cana. One scholar pointed out the juxtaposition of the stories, one showcasing the abundance Jesus offers, the other highlighting the challenge he poses. First, the blessing he wants to give, then the change he requires. A journey with Jesus will always include both abundance and challenge, blessing and change, joy and anger. Because we who follow Jesus will meet God in him. Then we'll see what God sees. We'll see how beautiful and beloved we are, reasons for joy. We'll also see how broken and mean we are, and how entrenched we've become in systems that deny people the abundant life God wants for them, reasons for anger. The question is, as we look back on our lives, will our standout memories and defining moments reflect any of the joy or the anger of Jesus Christ? Does what moved him move us to?